You open the fridge. You check the date on the milk. If something smells even a little off, it goes straight in the trash. No debate, no second sniff. For most of human history, that reflex would have made zero sense. The food that turns your stomach today wasn't a last resort for your ancestors. It was Tuesday. For roughly 2 million years of human evolution, disgust was a luxury almost nobody could afford. Your body's gag reflex, the one that fires the instant you smell spoiled meat, is ancient. But so is the behavior it was built to override, again and again, whenever hunger demanded it. Start with something small, something crunchy. Insects. Julie Lesnick, a biological anthropologist who has spent years studying the archaeological record of entomophagy, argues that insects weren't a fallback food for early humans. They were a reliable, year-round protein source, especially valuable during lean seasons when big game vanished. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, fish termites out of mounds with sticks they shape themselves. That behavior likely stretches back further than the human lineage does. Lesnick has also pointed out that termites and grubs are unusually rich in fat, something scarce and precious to a body burning enormous amounts of energy just to stay warm and mobile. Today, over 2,000 insect species are eaten somewhere in the world, and most documented foraging societies studied by anthropologists include insects in their regular diet. This is the detail that gets me every time. The ancient diet documentaries love to show all mammoth steaks and roaring fires, almost never mention the crickets. Think about what that actually looked like. Not a single desperate handful eaten in a famine. A routine stop on the way somewhere else. Flip a log, find a cluster of pale grubs, eat a few on the spot, wrap the rest in a leaf for later. Low effort, low risk, dependable calories, every single day of the year. In a way that hunting large animals almost never was. Now go bigger. Go rotten. John Speth, an archaeologist who has spent decades examining how Arctic and subarctic peoples handle meat, points to something modern audiences find hard to stomach. Literally, groups like the Inuit have long practiced deliberate fermentation of meat and fish, burying carcasses to let them break down for weeks or months before eating them. Kiviak, a traditional preparation made from dozens of seabirds fermented inside a sealskin, is real, documented, and still made today in parts of Greenland. Speth has proposed that some of this behavior, deliberately aging meat past the point most modern people would call edible, may stretch back into the Paleolithic, potentially including Neanderthals processing carcasses in cold storage pits. This part of his argument is more speculative than the ethnographic record on Arctic peoples, and other researchers push back on how far it can be extended into deep prehistory. Still, the underlying point holds up. Rotting isn't only decay. Under the right conditions, it's a slow chemical process that can make food safer, softer, and even more nutritious, not less. Consider what fermentation actually does to meat, biologically. Enzymes and bacteria break down tough muscle fibers, pre-digesting protein in a way that makes it easier for the human body to absorb. Some vitamin content can even increase during the process. To a modern nose, walking up to a fermentation pit would probably be unbearable. To someone who grew up eating this way, who learned exactly which smell meant ready and which meant gone wrong, it likely smelled like dinner. Here's where it gets stranger. Your ancestors weren't just eating unusual things. They were eating almost everything. Zooarchaeologists studying butchered animal bones from Paleolithic sites have found something consistent across hundreds of thousands of years and continents apart. Bones aren't just stripped of meat. They're smashed, cracked open along their length with stone hammerstones, over and over, to get at the marrow and grease packed inside. A single large mammal carcass could yield calories from meat. Yes, but also from marrow, brain tissue, and bone grease rendered by boiling crushed bone fragments in water. Researchers studying this practice describe it as a form of nutritional maximization. Nothing usable got left behind. Fat was calorie-dense and often scarce, especially in the lean months after a hard winter. So a carcass that modern eyes would see as picked clean was, to a Pleistocene forager, still full of food. Bone grease rendering, in particular, is labor-intensive in a way that tells you something about priorities. crushing bone into small fragments, boiling those fragments for hours, then skimming the fat that rises to the surface is a lot of work for a small amount of food. Researchers studying the resulting bone assemblages, fragmented into hundreds of small, unidentifiable splinters rather than a few clean long bones, take that fragmentation itself as evidence. People don't put in hours of grinding, cracking labor unless the payoff genuinely matters. When calories are scarce enough, an hour spent rendering grease from crushed bone can be worth more than an hour spent searching for something new to hunt. Even organs most modern diners skip past went to use. Brain tissue is soft, calorie-dense, and easy to access once a skull is opened. Marrow cavities inside limb bones are, pound for pound, some of the most fat-dense tissue an animal carcass offers, which is exactly why they were worth the effort of cracking open with a rock. Now for the part that tends to make people flinch. Cannibalism. At Gough's Cave, in Cheddar Gorge, England, archaeologist Sylvia Bello and colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London have spent years analyzing roughly 15,000-year-old human bones bearing cut marks nearly identical to the butchery marks left on animal remains from the same layer. Some of the skull fragments had been carefully shaped into cups. Bello's research, published through the museum and in peer-reviewed journals, doesn't claim this was an act of desperate survival. The evidence points somewhere more complicated, a deliberate, almost ritualized treatment of the dead that included consuming them. Whether that was driven by nutrition, by mourning, by belief, or by some combination researchers can't fully untangle from bone alone, is genuinely still debated. Other sites complicate the picture further. At Krapina, in modern-day Croatia, Neanderthal remains dating back over 100,000 years show similar cut marks and deliberately broken bones. Researchers are still split on what this means. Some argue it's strong evidence of cannibalism. Others argue the marks could reflect secondary burial practices or natural processes that mimic butchery damage after the fact. Nobody serious is claiming certainty here, and you should be skeptical of any documentary that tells you otherwise. At El Cedron, in northern Spain, the case looks stronger, at least for one specific group. A team led by zoo archaeologist Yolanda Fernandez Jalvo examined the remains of at least 12 Neanderthals from a single collapsed cave chamber dated to roughly 49,000 years ago. The bones carry cut marks consistent with defleshing, deliberate fractures consistent with marrow extraction, and human tooth marks. The same kind of stone tools used on nearby animal remains appear to have been used on these Neanderthal bones too. Even here, the published interpretation stays careful. This looks like nutritional cannibalism, likely tied to a period of severe hardship rather than a routine dietary habit. One group, one likely crisis, not a blanket claim about how Neanderthals normally treated their dead. So, were your ancestors just following instinct? Eating whatever they could stomach? Because starvation was always one bad week away? Not entirely. That's actually the twist. Amanda Henry, a researcher who studies dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, examined the fossilized teeth of Neanderthals from sites including Shanidar Cave in Iraq and Spy Cave in Belgium. Trapped in that calculus, she and her collaborators found microscopic starch granules from cooked plants, legumes, date palms, and other gathered foods, alongside evidence of grass seeds and grains. This runs directly against the old caveman stereotype of a creature obsessed purely with raw meat. Neanderthals, at multiple sites across different environments, were cooking, gathering, and combining a surprisingly broad range of foods. Insects, marrow, fermented meat, and even the dead, alongside roasted roots and starchy plants. It wasn't a diet of desperation. It was a diet of range. Picture a single day, reconstructed from that evidence. Morning starts with foraging, not hunting, gathering tubers, greens, maybe overturning logs for grubs and termites, because plant and insect foods were the dependable calories, the ones that didn't require a successful chase. Midday might bring a scavenged or hunted carcass, and the real work starts once the obvious meat is gone. Hours spent cracking long bones for marrow, boiling fragments for grease, using literally every gram the animal offered. There's no waste bin here. Every scrap either gets eaten, stored, or fed to nothing at all, because nothing goes to waste on purpose. Evening might mean pulling something out of a cold storage pit, dug days or weeks earlier, now transformed by fermentation into something softer and, by the standards of the group eating it, genuinely appetizing. Someone in the group knows exactly how long it's been down there. Someone remembers the last batch that went wrong and what it smelled like when it did. That knowledge, passed down and refined, is the real technology here, not a tool you can hold, but a set of judgments about food safety built from generations of trial and error. None of this reads as a horror story to the people living it. It reads as competence. Is it hard to imagine yourself doing any of this? Probably. But that gap says more about how far removed you are from producing your own food than it says about your ancestors' judgment. Here's the honest twist, the one that should reframe the whole video. What looks horrifying to you wasn't a sign of primitive suffering. It was a sophisticated survival toolkit, refined across hundreds of thousands of years, that treated almost nothing as waste and almost nothing as untouchable. Your gag reflex evolved for good reasons. Sure, spoiled food really can carry dangerous pathogens, but your ancestors weren't ignoring that risk out of ignorance. They were managing it through fermentation techniques, through careful food storage, through cultural knowledge about which forms of rotten were safe and which weren't, passed down and refined over countless generations. And some version of that toolkit is still on your plate right now, just dressed up differently. Cheese is controlled bacterial decay. Kimchi and sauerkraut are deliberate fermentation, not so different in principle from what Speth describes among Arctic peoples. Fish sauce, a staple in kitchens across Southeast Asia, is fermented for months. Even the sharp tang of a well-aged steak comes from a controlled breakdown of muscle tissue that, described plainly, sounds a lot like what horrified you at the start of this video. The line between spoiled and delicacy has always been thinner than it feels, and it was your ancestors, working out that line one meal at a time, who first drew it. Insects are having a quiet comeback too, not as a stunt, but as a serious conversation among nutrition researchers and food scientists about efficient protein for a growing population. Cricket flour shows up in energy bars now. None of this is your ancestors' exact diet returning wholesale. It's the same underlying logic resurfacing. Use the food source that's actually abundant, rather than the one that merely looks appetizing by habit. So the next time you check the date on the milk, it's worth remembering what that reflex is actually built on. Not squeamishness, not weakness, a few 100,000 years of your ancestors figuring out, meal by uncomfortable meal, exactly how far food could be pushed before it pushed back.